Hey everyone. So today I thought I'd talk about a very interesting topic that I feel like is definitely getting a lot more attention. That's definitely getting a lot more attention in the recent years. So this is actually going to be a crash course on how prompt engineering works, at least from my perspective for developers, and how you could leverage prompt engineering from various models to actually help you out with, let's say, coding exercises, understanding problem statements and whatnot. Let's kind of caveat why I think prompt engineering is becoming so important in our industry and why it's kind of need to know skill that a lot of developers, in my opinion, are going to be needing in the future. That out of the way, let's kind of cover a brief history as to how we got here. Basically, back in, I think it was 2018 or so, the first paper for Attention is All You Need was released from a team at Google, specifically for the purpose of building a chatbot system or chatgpt-like system, right? It was basically based on the idea of the transformer architecture, right? I'll link a paper down below of this. I think it's a very important one for anyone who's interested in machine learning on how to understand the idea that really brought this whole I guess you could say large language model into fruition. That paper really established what ChatGPT would eventually become and the idea of OpenAI, right? So there's a lot of models out there now. There's, variations of ChatGPT from OpenAI. There's a lot of Gemini or Gemna variations from Google. There's variations of Llama as well from Meta. There's a lot of these. There's common things that a lot of these models are good at, which is basically acting as a content generation sort of system. They're really good at summarizing, translation, chatbots, QA systems, code generations, and really the rise of these large language models kind of came into fruition from a couple things. One, the usability. Back in the day, these were not very usable, mostly because they were, one, very expensive to use, two, very expensive to train, and three, not the most accurate. And eventually that kind of just ballooned into the idea of other competitors kind of just trying to break into the market of, okay, well, if OpenAI is becoming very popular, let's try to build our own, GPT large language model system for this purpose. And so with that out of the way, now we know why these are very helpful. Let's actually kind of go through a couple examples as to why I think it's very critical for developers ourselves to actually know why these large language models are helpful for our job. Easiest examples that I see a lot of, LLMs being used or LLM-like systems integrated is actually GitHub Copilot. So I use VS Code quite a bit. And the GitHub Copilot is actually a variation of an LLM specifically for coding. And I've actually realized that when I'm coding myself and allowing Copilot to help me out a little bit, I've noticed that some of my code is a little cleaner. Some of the suggestions aren't the best, but having that that Copilot, if you will, to allow me to have a second opinion on code allows me to be more efficient and really understand where lack of efficiencies are being made in my code, right? Another really good example of where LLMs are used is I think of LLM as kind of like a second brain, or really understand your own thought process of, let's say, maybe you have an idea and you kind of want to walk through, you want to really understand your thought process. You could have ChatGPT actually replicate that and see if there's maybe some holes in your argument, right? You could also build a RAG, retrieval augmented generation QA system using a large language model in your own documents at a company to actually become the expert in your own system, right? So there's already a couple use cases as to where this could be used. So we'll go over two examples as to how I use LLMs specifically for prompt engineering, kind of the pitfalls and how I would use these, but also just how I would test them. So let's kind of go over these examples, right? When you're working with, the prompt engineering side of things, right? There's a couple things you really want to keep in mind. In order to make your prompts a lot more effective, there's a couple things I like to follow, right? Well, one, the idea is you always want to be very clear and concise on what you're asking the LLM. Because these are kind of stochastic and probabilistic models, even just changing the tone, or let's say even just the question just a little bit with your English language, it really is going to change the way the output is going to be. Let's get started. Okay, so let's actually get started with a very simple use case of where I think people could start to use LLMs a little bit easier, right? So we're going to jump here into ChatGPT, and what we're going to do is just ask it. And again, this is just the free version of ChatGPT, nothing special here. We're going to ask it to help us understand I don't know, just a simple idea of investment strategy, right? So let's give it a persona, right? You are a Let's see, a junior analyst. All right. So basically what we're asking ChatGPT is to pretend that it is a junior analyst, right? And it's going to be analyzing a portfolio, right? We want this portfolio basically to be a very balanced US equity portfolio, mainly between 10 to 15 stocks that are very diversified across the spectrum, right? But also we want this portfolio to be very resistant to recession. So let's see what ChatGPT gives us. All right, let's see what it's going to regret. Okay. So it's going to be recommending quite a bit of companies. So Microsoft, Broadcom, Alphabet, Costco, Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, United Healthcare Group, Berkshire, okay, Progressive, so Caterpillar, ExxonMobil, okay. Okay, so it's giving me a good amount of percent that I should invest in each company, okay. Good, interesting, okay, and then it gives you good reasons as to why it's picking those, okay. Let's actually say I don't necessarily like Starbucks. And let's say I don't necessarily know what Nextra Energy is. And let's say maybe Progressive. Okay. With other companies. So now what we're going to do is now we're going to kind of go through that chain of thought, right? So we gave it an initial prompt, but now we want it to correct this idea, right? Let's kind of say we want to get rid of these and let's see what it recommends from here. Okay, so it gave us an updated portfolio, which is pretty good. Okay, yeah, I would follow this advice right here, right? These are very high-end blue chip companies. It looks like they have a good balance sheet. They're a little expensive. But let's say now we also want to use this and save this output as something useful, right? So let's say, can you convert this output of your recommendations to a CSV file? Let's save this and let's actually view that file. Okay, so looking at this file now, let me make the screen a little bit bigger. We have a good idea of what ChatGPT is recommending to actually invest in. And if we actually do a quick total amount, let's double check if this is going to be a total of that 15,000. And it's about 15,000, which is really good. It looks like there'll be a bit of saved on the side just for a rainy day. So that's really good. I would say overall, I would give this sort of style of how I use, chain of thought to work through a problem, a really good example. So let's go over chat and let's ask it something else, right? So let's say you're a programmer and you're going to be, studying for a new language, right? I am not too familiar with, let's say, Golang, right? Let's give it a new persona. All right. So the idea really here is that, we want to tell ChatGPT that it is an instructor at, let's say, a computer science program or boot camp or what have you. And it's trying to tell that these students are trying to learn Golang. They already have a basic understanding of what Python and Java is, right? But they need to understand the why they should learn Go, right? So we wanted to design a curriculum around the idea that students already know the basics of programming fairly well, but they need a very brief crash course as to the advantages of using Golang and how they should learn to use it. So let's see what it gives us here. Okay, interesting. So it did give a little history that people should actually know about Go, as well as where Go is really good at being very, efficient and excels. Also, it gives some of the advantages of using Go versus Java and Python, which is really nice. And then it gave some assignments, which is really nice. So that's really interesting. And then it also gave us a curriculum, which is really nice. Okay. Let's actually export the curriculum you gave to a Word document. Oh, nice. Okay, and it looks like I could actually save this Word document as well, which is really nice. Yeah, I really like this output. Yeah, and so those are kind of just two simple examples as to where I use ChatGPT, right? Let's actually use let's use a different sort of system, mostly for programming, right? And let's go to, okay, so I'm gonna have two windows here. I'm gonna have my, I guess, prompt engineering Colab notebook here, and then I'm gonna have Google Gemini here. So let's say that we want to build a very extensive computer science model, right? So let's say, all right, so this is kind of the premise. So we want to build I guess you could say a RAG solution model, right? With using open source technologies, right? We want this model to be using Python and other open source models using Colab notebooks. And we want this model to become an expert in cryptocurrencies, just something fun, right? Nothing serious. And we also want to build out the Python notebook to accomplish this task. Okay, so this is the premise. We want this Colab, this Gemini, which is it's using the Pro model of Google. So it's a paid premium service for better, LLMs, right? So let's actually build this out and see what the initial values it's going to give us. Okay, so it looks like it's using a lot of open source technologies, specifically Google, which is really nice. I had to already make a few modifications to the code, but on its own, the code itself is pretty solid. It needs some work for cleaning up, but I think this is already a good basis actually to start. I could already see a couple errors in the code, which I'm already starting to fix, right? But what's really interesting is that it was able to just write generic code very well, in my opinion. So let's kind of run through it here. But let's actually jump down to here. This is actually the interesting part that I thought was very good, is that it was able to write out a very specific prompt, right? So it's asking for context, it's asking for the query for the RAG solution. But what's really nice too is that it's also giving you a optimal argument for if you have your device to train on LLMs and whatnot. So I'm gonna save the code here and kind of finish off the video with saying this. LLMs are a really powerful tool that make development and kind of just like chain of thought, or even just like having a second opinion on a lot of things when you're working on problems, very efficient. There's a lot of different practices that you could follow with prompt engineering. Typically, you kind of want to set up a persona, a premise, and then kind of set up the question you're asking for the LLM. But there's so many capabilities that an LLM could do. And as we've evolved as developers, I think that LLMs are going to become more relevant in a lot of cases, but it should also not be, using the excuse that, oh, it's an LLM, we don't need developers anymore, or developers should be very, really good if they get just given AI systems or LLMs. You need to understand that LLMs, again, are a tool kind of like autocorrect or a IDE, right? You don't need them, but they make you more efficient, right? And you should be able to do a lot of the same code and development even without, right, an LLM. Because if you can't develop without an LLM on your own, you're not going to be a very good, efficient developer in the end, right? So it has its pros and cons, but I definitely think that having LLMs in our ecosystem are here to stay. And I think there's more optimal ways that you could do this, and there's thousands of ways to get more efficient at prompt engineering. But again, it's a craft. There's no science to it. It's more of an art, unfortunately, too. And as we evolve, I'll probably give more feedback as to how LLMs are used. But this is kind of just like a simple crash course is how I use LLMs. All right, well, until next time, I'll reference the paper down below. I'll also reference the code. And I'll also reference a README of how I think LLMs are going to be of this whole video, right? Examples of how you should be prompting, right, with LLMs, right? So, all right, well, until then, catch you guys in the next one. Later.